Alright, in today's episode, we're going to take a look at nutrient timing and whether or not it's possible to actually build muscle and lose fat at the same time. I'll see you inside. And when I say build muscle and lose fat, I understand that that is a very controversial topic. Whether or not it's even possible to build muscle while you're losing body fat is a very complex subject. Additionally, you may hear different opinions from different experts in the field. Some experts actually argue that because you are in an energy deficit, there is no way that your body would prioritize increasing muscle if there's not enough nutrients to even maintain. However, I have a feeling that a lot of these people are looking at building muscle and losing fat as a 24-hour process. Specifically, every day you either decrease fat or increase fat. With that being said, I think if you look at it at a much more microscopic level of having phases of the day in which you can decrease body fat and having phases of the day where you can increase muscle mass, the idea of building muscle and losing fat becomes much more manageable. And this is completely my opinion, but I do think that an individual is able to have periods of the day in which they supply the body with the requisite nutrients and hormonal profile to increase their muscle mass. And then during the rest of the day, or the majority of the day, put themselves in the physiological state that's required to lose body fat. And at the end of the day, they have decreased the size of their fat cells and increased the size of their muscle cells. And this is where I think nutrient timing comes in. Quite simply just having abundance of nutrients around training so that we will actually grow the size of our cells, specifically the muscle cells, and then reducing the amount of nutrients that we're intaking throughout the rest of the day so that we're required to tap into what we have stored on our body to use as energy. Additionally, if we time this correctly, we can try and just shift the balance so that all the energy that we're using, or at least the majority, is coming from stored body fat, and all the tissue that we're laying down will be going into muscle and not contributing to body fat. So we can kind of look at it as a fat loss phase and a muscle mass phase. And during the phase of muscle building, we are not focusing or prioritizing fat loss, rather we're just trying to prevent to our best ability fat gain. And similarly, during the phases of fat loss, or the periods of time in which we are losing fat, we are not prioritizing building muscle, rather we are prioritizing supplying the body with enough alternative fuel sources so that we aren't breaking down muscle. And if we do things correctly, hopefully these fuel sources are going to be our stored body fat. So I'm not saying that we're going to lose fat and build muscle at the exact same times, but we can take periods of the day for which this occurs. Now let's give this structure a little bit more detail. So throughout the day, we have what's referred to as protein turnover. This is the process of maintaining the muscle tissue we already have by breaking it down and building it back up. And this is why everyone always recommends eating protein, because we're going to have a certain amount of muscle tissue breakdown throughout the day, and if we supply the amino acids through eating protein, then we can rebuild it and basically maintain where we're at. And then we use exercise to create a stressor or a stimulus that growing muscle would be important and very helpful. So then the body will go above and beyond just turning over the protein and maintaining, but it will actually begin to increase the size of our muscles. And now this is why I would say that if you are an extremely high-level bodybuilder, it may be very difficult to lose fat and build muscle at the same time. Simply put, more muscle mass means more protein turnover. So for many of these individuals, it's very difficult to get enough amino acids to supply both protein turnover and muscle growth during a phase of dieting. I personally believe that surrounding exercise are the meals that we want to put ourselves in a state of muscle building, which means we're going to periodically halt fat loss in an effort to increase our muscle mass. And like I discussed, the benefit of this is that exercise is the stimulus that we should put extra nutrients towards building muscle rather than increasing our body fat. And now the best mechanism, I believe, for this would be to have a meal prior to training with an abundance of both amino acids and carbohydrates, so protein and carbohydrates, but also having minimal fatty acids in that meal, so trying to have a meal that's actually low in fat. And now, I don't recommend eating low fat, but surrounding training with an abundance of protein and carbohydrates, it might actually be a benefit. So the role of the carbohydrates is actually to purposefully increase insulin. With that being said, someone following a low carbohydrate diet could simply just eat an abundance of amino acids, basically just replacing the amount of carbohydrates they would eat with extra protein. That protein could then be used for gluconeogenesis to make glucose and increase our blood glucose, which would then stimulate the production of insulin. And now insulin is going to allow for amino acids to better enter the muscle. And I believe this is why it appears that people eating a higher protein but low carbohydrate diet have a much easier time increasing muscle mass than someone on a lower protein, low carbohydrate diet. Simply, it appears that insulin is almost necessary for someone to increase their muscle mass. So coming back to the example of a high carbohydrate, high protein, lower fat diet, the goal of this meal would be to have sufficient amount of glucose and amino acids in the bloodstream during training. And we do this by having this meal before training. And we do this because during training there will be a very high energy demand. Therefore, it is definitely a period of time in which we would risk catabolizing muscle tissue in order to fuel the working muscles with such a high energy demand. However, if we have the requisite supply of glucose from that pre-workout meal, we can help preserve our muscle tissue because we will likely rely on the glucose to fuel the exercise. Additionally, the abundance of amino acids we had makes it even less likely for the body to turn to the muscle, which is the largest storage of amino acids, to supply any amino acid needs that we may have. And now, I do think it is of benefit to do this before training as well as after training. And the reason I say this is because exercise itself increases the uptake of nutrients independent of insulin. Typically, the only way to facilitate storage of nutrients into a cell is through insulin signaling. And typically at rest, the only way to make this occur is if we put ourselves in an acute energy surplus. But since insulin isn't very selective, we'll also be storing this energy surplus into our fat tissue as well. And this is why many people actually have a fear of insulin, because it's not very selective and oftentimes leads to excess fat gain. However, exercise actually acts as an insulin mimetic, but typically only for the working muscle. Therefore, the abundance of fuel we gave ourselves before the exercise, we use the exercise to ensure that the site of storage of these nutrients is in the working muscle, helping to minimize the storage of body fat. And the reason I don't suggest an abundance of fat in this meal is that weightlifting is typically an exercise that will predominantly use glucose as a fuel source. And now if we have an abundance of fatty acids in this meal, they may end up just being diverted directly into fat tissue. This is because there will be an increase in insulin after eating the meal. And then if we go to work out, we're likely going to be using the amino acids and the glucose, but not have much use for the fatty acids. And while there are actually fat storages inside of our muscle, they're not that large. So the more likely route for these fatty acids, if we do include them in that meal, is going to be into fat tissue. So simply just as a preventative measure, I would just suggest eating a large amount of protein and a large amount of carbohydrates in this meal, but trying to keep the dietary fat lower. And then after training, we'd want to have a very similar meal as before training. And now we're going to use the spike of insulin in this meal as the exact same way as last time. And since training both broke down muscle tissue and depleted our glycogen stores, if we have an abundance of amino acids and carbohydrates following training, we are much more likely to use the glucose to replenish muscle glycogen and use the amino acids to rebuild the muscle tissue that we broke down as a result from training. And now I do really want to mention both water and sodium in this meal. We can actually use the water to facilitate the storage of glycogen, and this is because every gram of glycogen requires approximately 3 grams of water. And now that's just a rough approximation. But this is inside of the cell, and in order to get the water inside of the cell, we would want to intake sodium because that will help transport the water from the bloodstream into the cell. And now I think there definitely is a benefit of trying to replenish the body after exercise, not only of amino acids, but also of carbohydrates. Obviously, the signal of exercise will prioritize the rebuilding and growth of muscle, so that is very likely where the amino acids will go. Additionally, I do think it's important to try and replenish glycogen stores. This is so we can use our stored glycogen throughout the remainder of the day to supply any glucose needs we have, so we will not turn to amino acids for gluconeogenesis. And now these are the two meals that I like before and after training. However, it doesn't have to be 10 minutes before training and 10 minutes after. The goal is simply to have enough nutrients in the bloodstream during training and then replenish the body after training. However, if the goal is fat loss, I do recommend trying to bolus the nutrients before training so that we can leave the rest of the day to have low nutrient availability and prioritize fat loss. And luckily, that post-workout window that many people talk about is actually much longer than people think. Meaning, technically, this meal doesn't have to come directly after your workout, and it appears it could come even 12 hours after your workout and still have the same effect, or at least a similar effect. However, I prefer to bolus it right after the workout, so once again, we can leave the rest of the day open for fat loss. And now we can think of the pre-workout, workout, and post-workout window as the anabolic phase of the day. And now we can move on to the catabolic or fat loss phase. During this phase, it is paramount to supply the body with sufficient amino acids to support muscle retention. It's important to note that amino acids are not just used for muscle. Therefore, having an abundance of amino acids in our bloodstream will decrease the likelihood that we will resort to the largest pool of amino acids, which are our muscles, for any of our amino acid requirements. Amino acids are also used to create hormones and neurotransmitters. And quite simply, unless you have a metabolic disease, it's very difficult to find a reason why having excess or extra amino acids would be a problem, given that they're coming from high-quality protein sources. And now it is during this phase of the day that we would kind of just switch the macronutrient profile from carbohydrates to more predominantly fat. However, as long as we keep our insulin levels low and have our glucagon levels high, we will be able to be in what I refer to as the fat loss physiology. Simply, you can think of your physiology as being either insulin dominant or glucagon dominant. That anabolic phase that we discussed would be insulin dominant, in which we are prioritizing storing nutrients inside of the cell. And a glucagon dominant environment would be low insulin, and we produce glucagon to liberate stored tissue for energy. And the production of glucagon is stimulated by having low energy availability. And interestingly, the cells that produce glucagon are turned off by insulin. And now I discussed this in an earlier podcast, but if you missed it, this is what I call the diabetic paradox. Quite simply, diabetics have poor insulin sensitivity oftentimes. So they will have high blood glucose and produce insulin to try and shuttle that glucose inside of the cells. However, since they have poor insulin sensitivity, they have a difficult time actually getting the glucose and other molecules inside of the cells. Additionally, the insulin isn't working to signal to the pancreas to stop the production of glucagon. So glucagon levels stay high and continue to liberate body tissues in order to create even more glucose. This is why diabetics have such a difficult time just trying to regulate their blood glucose. But, to get back to the main point, a healthy person will produce glucagon when we have low insulin and low blood glucose. And now there are a few different things that glucagon will do. It will break down stored glycogen to create glucose to secrete into the bloodstream. It will also liberate triglycerides from fat tissue. And if necessary, it will promote what's referred to as gluconeogenesis. And this would be making new glucose molecules specifically out of the glycerol backbone on triglycerides and of amino acids. So the goal of this phase is simply to just supply enough nutrients so that we don't turn to amino acids for gluconeogenesis. And now the body always has a requirement for glucose. This is because there are certain cell types in the brain that actually require glucose to function. This is very likely because they lack a mitochondria, so they must go through fermentation, which can only be done through glucose or other carbohydrate molecules. And this is where that post-workout meal comes in handy, because we restored our glycogen. Therefore, that glycogen can be used to maintain the energy supply for the brain and tissues that might require glucose. And if throughout the remainder of the day we remain in a low-intensity exercise state, such as just doing our daily tasks, walking, and other things that aren't very glycolytic or require glucose, most of our energy can be derived from fatty acids, which is exactly what our muscle tissue is made of. Quite simply, the goal of all of this would be simply just to give the body a reason that it should use stored body fat for energy, and it should prioritize any of the amino acids that we're eating to put into muscle tissue and to even grow muscle tissue. And this is why I do actually believe that it's possible to lose fat and build muscle at the same time. And I hope this just acts as a perspective switch to, instead of looking every day as today I'm going to lose fat, maybe looking at specific periods of the day as this is my fat loss period and this is my muscle gain period. And now, I definitely do think that this would be much easier for someone that has excess body fat and is newer to the gym. Simply, these people have a larger supply of fat to use for energy. And if you don't have sufficient muscle mass, you have both reduced protein turnover throughout the day, and you don't require a large amount of muscle breakdown in order to signal to grow muscle. Therefore, your protein breakdown throughout the day is simply just going to be much lower, meaning you'll probably just get far more out of the same amount of amino acids as someone who already is carrying around a lot of muscle mass, simply because their amino acid requirements are much higher because of the amount of protein turnover that they do on a daily basis. And they also require much more intense stimulus and probably more muscle breakdown to signal to grow even more muscle. And that's why I personally believe that it seems that newbies seem to get the best results and have the greatest ability to lose fat and gain muscle at the same time. And it appears to be extremely difficult for someone who already has a lot of muscle mass and has been training for a long time to both lose body fat and build muscle at the exact same time. With that being said, they can still use these same tips to try and maintain as much muscle as humanly possible while they're losing fat. So just because you may not be in a position to have a crazy body transformation where you gain a lot of muscle and lose a lot of body fat, these strategies are applicable to anyone who's trying to maintain as much muscle mass as possible and lose body fat. They can also be helpful if you're trying to gain muscle and minimize the amount of body fat you're trying to gain. Energy maintenance, so we actually reduce the likelihood that we would become catabolic during the rest of the day and still have this very strong anabolic phase during the middle of the day or whenever you decide to have pre-workout and post-workout meals. Alright, I think I'm about done rambling for today, and I really hope you enjoyed this episode. And I also hope to see you in the next episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope